honored to be here tonight moderating this event. This evening is an educational event. The League of Women Voters and some of the other sponsors, who are a nonprofit 501c3 organizations, adhere to the rule that they remain nonpartisan. And this is strictly an opportunity for the community to interface with some people who are subject matter experts and have an opportunity to learn what is happening with the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department, and specifically the new sheriff who has been in his position for a year now. It's hard to believe it's been a year. So it's been a year since Alex Villanueva was elected. It was really a surprise for his election. It was sort of a David and Goliath story. Alex Villanueva ran against McDonald, who many thought was definitely going to win because an incumbent hasn't lost in over 100 years. But Alex Villanueva surprised us all, and he was supported and endorsed by many who were right in this room. Let's just talk a little bit about why we're having this event tonight. So Alex Villanueva has come under fire for reversing many of his positions, the positions that he campaigned on. Some of those positions were to be transparent, to get ICE out of the prisons. And for those of you who are unaware, ICE is the Immigration's Customs Enforcement Agency, had a direct line in the LA County prison. With all of the opposition that the sheriff has received, does he have a statement? And what I did was I had gone through lots of readings to see what it is that the sheriff is saying about the positions that he's taking, because his positions seem to be directly opposing what he originally said. The first thing he says is that, and this is a quote, "I'm not doing anything I didn't say I was going to do while on the campaign trail." He doesn't speak specifically about what it is that he's not doing, that he said he was not going to do, but he says he's not doing anything that he said he was going to do on the campaign trail. He claims that the previous administration, McDonald had gotten rid of over 400 deputies and civilian employees. And Villanueva claims that the McDonald administration thought that the more people who were fired, it was a sign of reform. And that they were trying to re-examine every termination case to ensure it was a proper decision based on facts. He felt that because he had had a long history in law enforcement, that he had a better understanding of the system from inside out. And he says, quote, "I could see where it was strong and I could see where it was rotten." He also said, and this is one thing that's been very interesting about Villanueva, he still is out in the public, marching in parades, going to forums, and even under the growing criticism, he remains unflappable. He says that the Board of Supervisors, and this is a quote, "There's a wholesale campaign of mass firings with very grave consequences, and the Board of Supervisors didn't care. They thought that the more the people were fired, that it was somehow better, that it was a sign of reform. They didn't care if the terminations were illegal." Villanueva reappointed at least 3, and some would argue more, very controversial law enforcement officers. One in particular, a man by the name of Mandoyan. Mandoyan had been accused, or allegedly was involved in domestic violence. Villanueva is quoted as saying that that domestic violence allegation was a private relationship between 2 consenting adults that went bad. He claims, quote, that the LA County Board of Supervisors is involved in nothing but a naked power play, and they want to control the entire county. And while he promised to get ICE out of the jails, and he did, He replaced ICE with third-party contracting. We're going to hear from the subject matter experts. We have with us Sam Paz. Sam is a civil rights attorney, and he is a board member of the Southern California ACLU. And Sam was very involved in the founding of the commission that now Brian K. Williams is the executive director of, and Brian K. Williams is the executive director of the Los Angeles Sheriff's Department Civilian Oversight Commission. And I want each of them to spend about 15 minutes. Sam, would you please set the stage and talk to us about why there was a need to establish the commission?
I'm a civil rights lawyer. I've been doing this for almost 42 years. I supported Lee Baca when he was running for office because he ran as a progressive. I also supported Mr. Villanueva because he ran as a progressive. Okay, we'll start in the fall of 2011. County jails were embroiled in a criminal debacle characterized by a pattern of unconstitutional policing. Inmates, civilian monitors, members of the clergy assigned to the jails signed affidavits under penalty of perjury that they had either been victimized by or witnessed violent and unprovoked physical attacks by sheriff's deputies on inmates. These deputies also fomented division amongst prisoners that resulted in inmate-on-inmate fights, and which were used then to justify the deputies using more violence to intervene in the fights. Conditions in the jail were so bad that the FBI and the U.S. Department of Justice opened a comprehensive investigation into the jail system run amok. In response, the deputy higher-ups attempted to frustrate these inquiries and cover up the evidence of unconstitutional acts. The Board of Supervisors approved the creation of the Citizens Commission on Jail Violence, which I'll refer to as the CCJV, consisting of distinguished experts, jurists, law enforcement officers, and members of the clergy. The CCJV returned a landmark decision in 2012, a 600-page report that provided a roadmap for reform to establish an independent inspector general to oversee the department, to establish swifter discipline for those found in violation of department policies, and establish a culture of constitutional policing and consequences for those that would not acculturate. 2013, Sheriff Lee Baca was convicted for obstruction of justice in an investigation of inmate abuse, as was the Under Sheriff Paul Tanaka and others. In 2014, Jim McDonald was elected sheriff and tasked with implementing his recommendations. Many of the reforms have been implemented. 2018 elections. Incumbent Sheriff Jim McDonald lost in an upset to Alex Villanueva, who campaigned as the progressive candidate. Democrats and liberal groups backed Villanueva over McDonald. Villanueva had promised to kick out the ICE, the immigration ICE, out of the county jail and install more outside reforms for the sheriff's department. As a candidate, Villanueva's folks frequently spoke about reform, transparency, and public integrity. In his first few weeks in office, Villanueva, who had no experience in running any large organization, sowed chaos by removing 18 high-ranking officials from their posts and reevaluating the ranks of over 500 other commanders. Some deputies said it was no longer clear who was really in charge. In January 30th, 2019, during a speech, Villanueva attacked the CCJV reforms embraced by the department and dismissed efforts by the department to reduce force against inmates. The core problem that led to all this culture of jail abuse, he basically said it was a social experiment that had backfired and put lives at risk. He displayed some charts and graphs, and he said that showed that the assaults on staff, inmate-on-inmate violence, and use of force in the jails had increased after the reforms were established by Sheriff McDonald. He cited this turned out to be untrue. The department, citing department statistics, the Los Angeles Times reported that the significant force by deputies, incidents causing any type of injury, was down by 60% from 2009 when it hit its highest point in nearly a decade. A federal court monitor overseeing the consent decree that had been imposed upon the jails, as well as other watchdogs, agreed that the most severe bone-breaking injuries that had been happening had nearly vanished. Assistant Sheriff Bob Olmsted, who had spoken out about the jail abuse in 2012, agreed with the federal monitor. Villanueva also claimed that under the previous administration, jail employees were directed to stop counting gassings. Gassings were throwing of urine or feces on deputies as instances of inmate violence against staff because they were too numerous. That also was untrue. That claim was refuted by Catherine Blitz, who oversaw the jail system as a member of the Office of the Inspector General, and a former Assistant Sheriff Kelly Harrington, who served under McDonald, agreed, saying that gassings were always considered serious and always reported. In 2019, the County Board of Supervisors took the unusual step of publicly rebuking Villanueva for reinstating Carl Medoyan, who had been fired in connection with the allegations of stalking and abuse, which were supported by video evidence. Board of Supervisors filed an unprecedented lawsuit against Medoyan's rehiring because the sheriff didn't have the authority to override the decisions by the Civil Service Commission, which upheld the deputy's termination. At a public meeting on March 12th, Villanueva told the supervisors that as of that date, he had reinstated only one deputy, Medoyan, and all other reinstatements were on hold. That was also not true. After the department fired the deputy, Martin Cortell, on June 18th, concluded that he used unreasonable force and failed to use de-escalation techniques in a 2016 incident. But Villanueva reinstated him in February of 2019 as a deputy during his first few months in office. On March 27th, 2019, Supervisor Mark Ridley Thomas said Villanueva's comments to the board displayed an emerging pattern of inconsistencies and even blatant misrepresentations about deputy reinstatements. Supervisor Sheila Buell said that beyond the questions about the sheriff's authority, we have to be concerned about whether the rehiring deputies are qualified and whether they can keep the public trust, she said. My concerns are deepening about the judgment of the sheriff. April 5, 2019, the Los Angeles Times reported Villanueva had reinstated at least 6 deputies who were previously discharged according to county documents obtained by the Times. The first list provided to the Times included 27 former employees that were put back on the county payroll since December 3 when Villanueva took office. April 12, 2019. Officials working under Villanueva had been inactivating internal investigations of department personnel at a high rate, with most cancellations not conforming to department policies according to the Office of Independent, the Attorney General, the Office of Inspector General report. Many of the 45 investigations inactivated from January 1 through February 28 involve criminal allegations such as child abuse, domestic violence, having sexual relationships with inmates, and policy violations such as sleeping on duty and using derogatory language. The report also noted that other changes to employee discipline had been made in recent months, including cases in which the department moved to fire deputies for misconduct, such as brandishing a weapon while intoxicated and fraternizing with members of criminal street gangs, by allowing settlements that allowed the deputies to keep their jobs and serve days of suspension instead of being fired. To have such large numbers of inactivations literally is to cover the public's eyes on these matters before the truth comes out. This is the exact opposite of transparency, a commissioner of the Sheriff's Civilian Oversight Commission stated. April 27, 2019. For years, the department has done nothing to rein in deputy gangs, largely because their lawyers have argued that deputy cliques and tattoos were protected by the First Amendment. The Sheriff's Civilian Oversight Commission challenged that argument based on Supreme Court cases that allowed the government entities to restrict employee speech in certain circumstances, and the commissioners unanimously voted to direct the OIG to conduct an investigation into the deputy cliques. On May 7, 2019, Sheriff Villanueva revived a drug team that was sharply critical for disproportionately stopping Latino drivers on the 5 freeway, asserting that the drug unit would follow strict constitutional guidelines to prevent racial profiling. These would be the same constitutional guidelines that they were found not to be following when the drug team was suspended after the OIG investigation. OIG found the unit was inherently built to violate constitutional rights in a vast number of people passing through the freeway. A Los Angeles Times investigation detailed how the team had pulled over and searched the vehicles of more than 3,500 drivers who turned out to have no drugs or other illegal terms. The overwhelming majority of those persons were Latinos. May 13th. In June, Villanueva insisted cities patrolled by Los Angeles Sheriff's Department, contract cities, couldn't care less about his decision to reinstate troubled deputies. In response, the city's membership organization said the sheriff's comment about the contract cities was, quote, inaccurately and highly troubling, close quotes. The leaders of the California Contract Cities Association complained in a letter, quote, there is significant risk associated with reinstating deputies who have a history of excessive force and other misconduct and were previously dismissed in accordance with long-established department policy, particularly if those department deputies are ever assigned to a contract city. May 21, 2019. Civilian Oversight Commission requests an explanation and documents from Sheriff Alex Villanueva on why at least 45 cases were inactivated in January and February 2019, according to the OIG report. They were shelved before the detectives could complete investigations into allegations of child abuse, sexual misconduct, and other law enforcement policy violations. Report them, and report them again. The report cited data from various news articles indicating that since 2017, Latinos across the country have been reporting fewer crimes to local police due to fears about federal immigration enforcement by the Trump administration. May 28th, 2019, the Democratic Party of the Central San Fernando Valley, an umbrella group of 21 clubs that phone banged for Villanueva, issued a public rebuke of what it called the sheriff's unilateral action on rehiring and called for rescinding all the employment decisions made by the sheriff's reconciliation panel. The resolution was forwarded to the county Democratic Party. July 14th, 2019. The Times reported that FBI agents who have been asking deputies about inner workings of the Bandidos, a deputy gang at the East Los Angeles station, who brand themselves by matching tattoos of skeletons with a sombrero, gun belts on their chest, and a pistol. The agents have been trying to decipher whether leaders of the Bandidos require or encourage prospects to commit illegal acts, planting evidence, engaging in unlawful shootings to gain membership in the group. Former Sheriff Jim McDonald abolished an insignia that refers to the East LA station as, quote, Fort Apache, close quotes, after a comprehensive study, but not a formal investigation, that he was mindful of the deputies' First Amendment rights in having tattoos. Shortly after taking office, Villanueva brought back the banned East LA station logo, which also features an image of a boot with a riot helmet and the words low profile and a Spanish phrase that means always kick in the pants. The logo rose out of confrontations between law enforcement and anti-Vietnam War veteran protesters during the 1970 Chicano moratorium rally. July 18th, 2019. In a court deposition, a top official, Alicia Alt, who served as the chief of the department's professional standards and training division, said she was told by incoming sheriff chief staff that it was Villanueva's #1 priority to reinstate Carl Mordian before Villanueva took office, so it would appear to have been done by the administration of former Sheriff Jim McDonald. She resigned in protest rather than carry out what she said was a highly unethical and unheard of directive from Sheriff Villanueva to reinstate a fired deputy and alter his disciplinary action.
So, Sam?
Yes.
We want to try to get out of here exactly at 8:30.
Okay,
So, if I may, can we shorten some of this last page, just make some bullet points?
all right, I'll try to do that.
Thank you so much.
I think I'm up to about 12 minutes.
17 minutes.
How many?
17.
17? Okay.
17, no,
Then,
gotta wrap it up.
Okay, the bullet points I have would be July 19th, the Los Angeles Magazine article, Meet Sheriff Villanueva, the Donald Trump of Los Angeles Law Enforcement. And it was based on Villanueva's propensity to dump predecessors and thumb his nose at critics. And a number of people point out that his statements are very troubling because they bring in a message to the deputies to be more aggressive. It was the original problem, the way that jails were being controlled. July 23rd, Villanueva basically has cut off all of his staff membership. The office of the OIG offices, telling his staff to cut off documents and access to his employees. The huntsman, who was the head of the Office of Independent Inspection, was hired to, he said, I was hired to tell you that if we ever faced a Tanaka-level crisis, we face it now. Huntsman went on to tell the supervisors that he could not, he was basically being blocked out of any documents from the Sheriff's Department, even though he was supposed to inspect. The Board of Supervisors then looked into whether there should be subpoena power for the office, and goes on and lists a number of other activities that Villanueva had done to prevent him. The Inspector General then on August 12th, went on to report that to the Board of Supervisors that Villanueva was delaying, hindering, and ignoring, in some cases denying outright requests for information on hiring, discipline, and shootings. 2 days later, on August 14th, Villanueva launched a criminal investigation of the OIG, and basically for the purpose of intimidation.
Thank you so much, Sam. We're real fortunate to have Brian Williams, who's the Executive Director of the Los Angeles Sheriff's Department Civilian Oversight Commission. And now, Brian, if you can drill down a little deeper and tell us from your perspective your points on some of the things that Sam just covered.
The work that we do is not an academic exercise for us. You know, daily we're reminded of a couple of names that have come to our attention, unfortunately, because these young men have been killed by the Sheriff's Department during the time that we have been in existence. So I think about an Anthony Weber in February of 2019. I think of a Ryan Twyman. I think of an Anthony Vargas, and I think of a Paul Rea. Those are just four of the many young men or people who have died or had some serious injury as a result of actions of the Sheriff's Department. Number two, I want to say this. Not every sheriff deputy is bad. I have great support and admiration and love for those who go out there daily to do their jobs. It is a tough, difficult job that they do. But the third thing is this. None of them were drafted to do that job. Not one of them were drafted to do that job. And so when you think about what makes us this country, what makes us America, and we talk about this Constitution that we hold so highly and dearly, that Constitution comes alive in the lives of those men and women who are out there on that street every day. They have the power to take a person's life legally. They have the power to arrest your constitutional liberties. That's where that Constitution comes alive, and they have to be reminded on a daily basis of the tremendous power that they have for every person who is in this room. So it is not an academic exercise for us at all. This is real in what we do, and we remind ourselves of that daily because we get calls daily. So our commission was established in December of 2016. I started the job on December 6, 2016. I remember that day very, very well. Started out with just me, and now we have 7 employees, and we are an advisory commission. We don't have the power over the Sheriff's Department budget. We can't hire. We can't fire. We rely heavily upon the Office of Inspector General, Max Huntsman, who's sitting up here, who probably should be up here, for much of the information that we receive. But what we do have is the power of the bully pulpit. You know, we can shine some lights on some things that we think the department is doing right, things that we think the department is doing wrong, and we have a very loud voice in doing that. We have 9 commissioners. Did I see Sean Kennedy?
Not here.
Not here? Okay. 9 commissioners, 2 retired judges, a number of lawyers, a retired LASD lieutenant, executive director, a minister, several law professors. So it's a pretty august group. They know what they're doing. They're a very smart group, and I think we're very calculated in what we've been doing. So what do? We're an advisory commission. We don't have power. We don't have authority. What we do have is the power of the people. And I want to publicly, as I do every time I get a chance to speak, to say, you know, yeah, it was an action of the Board of Supervisors that established this commission, but it was the actions of the community. Groups like Black Lives Matter, Youth Justice Coalition, Dignity and Power Now, and groups like this who said, you know what, enough is enough. We've got to have some sort of oversight of this department. Now, let me talk about the department just for a second. Sheriff's Department was established in 1850, right? Formally established in 1850. So that means for 150 plus years, they had no oversight. Our sheriff is generally elected by the people. If you want to get rid of the sheriff, you got to vote him out of office or you got to arrest him. One of the two, both of which has happened in the past 3 years. Not an easy task to do. But it's been established for that 150 years without any sort of oversight. I was telling our moderator earlier, my family moved out here from Tennessee. We moved to the Watts area of Los Angeles. And I specifically remember my father telling me that if you ever get stopped by the sheriffs, watch out. There was something about getting stopped by LAPD. You kind of knew what was going to go on, but if you got stopped by the sheriff, you had to watch out. And the unfortunate thing is that same feeling exists so much today. You go to certain communities, even here in Altadena, in northwest Pasadena, you go to certain communities and that same feeling exists. If you see a sheriff's vehicle behind you, if you're going to deal with the sheriff, your anxiety level goes from 0 to 100. And it may be just perceived, it may be real, but there's something about that department, and that's the battle that has to be fought. How do you fight that department, that battle from the department perspective? It's not by hiring a Carl Mandonia. It's not by saying that the inspector general is illegally doing some stuff and investigating the inspector general. It's not by the shootings or the harassment that we hear by. It's by transparency. It's by hiring people who look like me and who look like you in that department. It's by upholding those principles of integrity and service that they have on the side of their car every day. That's how you do it, and that's our stead. That's what we do. We want to make this department more transparent. We want to increase the level of integrity, but most importantly, we want to increase the level of trust between the community and the department. Not an easy thing to do when every time you turn around, there's some shooting or there's some article or there's something going on which affects that whole notion of trust. And it's not just the LA Sheriff's Department. It's the whole notion of policing in our country. Because I call the names of Anthony Weber and Ryan Twyman and Vargas, but I could easily call the name of an Eric Gardner, right? Or any number of young men across the country who have been failed as a result of actions by the police department. We have to fix this. So what have we been doing? We have a monthly meeting, which is on the 3rd Tuesday of the month. We've been trying to move that around a little bit, where we take public comment. And we have a really hard-working staff. We have a very hard-working set of commissioners who work on multiple issues. Our first big issue when we started in December of 2016. We started as a staff in December 2016. We had our first meeting in February of the following year, about 30 days later. Was to deal with the issue of what do they call them? Drones. There's an official name for it. What do they call them?
I don't remember that. There's an acronym.
Yeah.
Aerial surveillance vehicles.
Yeah. Anyway, they're flying them. We tell them not to fly them, they're flying them. So we dealt with the issue of drones. And then we started on the issue of the sheriff's cooperation with ICE. And then in our second month, on the 16th day of February, unfortunately, there was a horrific shooting in South Los Angeles. And we had an immediate public hearing about it, which was just crazily emotional. And it showed the pent-up emotion that people had about this sheriff's department in their hearts and in their communities. And we went on and we established a family assistance program with the help of the Youth Justice Coalition and other groups. That program is a really important one. It does a couple things. One, if you ever see the shooting of a young man or a young woman by law enforcement on television, they will often, the first thing they will say is that this gang member did this, or this person who was involved in this did that. When really, they don't really know that information. So we're trying to get them to stop doing that. There's an issue about who's going to pay for funeral expenses. I can't tell you how many times I've received a phone call where someone has died in custody, or they've died at the hands of law enforcement, and they've said, you know what, we're going to have a chicken dinner set. We're going to have a car wash to bury our loved ones. Well, despite the issue that's occurring with the family, that has a definite effect upon the community itself. And how do you increase the trust between the community and the sheriff's department or the police department when they can't bury their loved ones? We have to do something about that, right? Right now, our big issue that we're talking about is this whole issue of deputy gangs that Max and others of you are so familiar with. The department says they don't exist, that it is really just a hazing issue. We disagree with that. We're going to be working with the Office of Inspector General and the Rand Corporation to address some of those issues. So there's some real solid work that's going on with the Commission and with the department. Someone asked me recently, well, what has changed in the department? What have you guys done that's changed in the department? And I had to remind them of something that my old football coach told me. He said, listen, Brian, change isn't better, better is better. So we're not just going to change stuff. We want to make things better. And we do that by attending things like this. We do that by making sure that the community stays engaged in what we're doing. We do that by making sure that we're working with the Board of Supervisors, with the Office of Inspector General. And we do that by listening to the community partners that we have who've worked so hard to get us to where we are today. It's a tough job that we have ahead of us. Nationally, policing is a very, very tough job. No one wants to be a cop. Think about it. You're going to have someone with a cell phone following what you do every day. You're going to be on television. They're going to spit on you. But again, I'll remind you, none of those guys were drafted. None of those women were drafted. If you sign up for the job, you must respect my rights. You got to respect your rights. And we're going to make sure that happens. So I think I'm at 15 minutes of getting the wave in the back of the room. Okay, my last 4 seconds.
According to him, have 10 more minutes.
No, we gotta get through.
I'm getting the wind up in the back. So with that, I'll wait for the questions, but thank you for the invitation to come out.
Okay, thank you so much, Brian. Thank you for that. He's got so now Melina Abdul, she's going to be talking about her subject matter. She's a subject matter expert on Black Lives Matter LA and their role with this issue.
So I don't know that I'm a subject matter expert as much as I'm an organizer with Black Lives Matter. And a lot of the work that we did are doing. Our co-founder Patrice Cullors is one of the reasons that there is a Civilian Oversight Commission in the first place, and that is based on our lived experiences, right? As Black people who live in Los Angeles County, we experience violence at the hands of LA County sheriffs on a regular basis. So I appreciate Brian for lifting up that this is more than an academic paper. This is more than numbers. These are real people that we are working with. What compelled Patrice to get into this work is the violence that her own brother was experiencing at the hands of sheriffs inside LA County jails. And so we need to recognize that every hashtag, every name that we call, there are real families. So the names that Ryan just called, Anthony Weber, A.J. Weber is what his family calls him, that he was a 16-year-old child who was simply leaving a Super Bowl party when LA County sheriffs shot him in the back on a Super Bowl Sunday, and then did what they do. And I'm going to get through some of the steps, some of what we're trying to tackle when we say we're a little bit different. So when Brian says he thinks that there's good sheriffs out there, I think that there are not. And I want to be straight up about that, and I'm not attacking the individual people, because some of you are going, well, my uncle is a cop or is a sheriff. It's not about whether they're funny at the table at Thanksgiving. It's about that they work for a system that is deliberately designed to put targets on our backs. And so, regardless if they're funny, they are engaging in the systematic oppression, especially of black people. And so we need to uplift that, right? And we need to recognize that it takes more than just saying, let's weed the bad ones out. Some of you may have seen the news article that came out today, or yesterday, that outlines and lists, thankfully, many of the law enforcement officers who've been convicted of crimes and are still wearing badges. More than a dozen of them are LA County sheriffs, right? And so we can sometimes get to these lists and start getting into these bad apple arguments, and we absolutely want to hold the so-called bad apples accountable, right? It's ridiculous that our district attorney, Jackie Lacey, is refusing to prosecute police and sheriffs who kill our people, that 500, the newest number is 576 people killed by law enforcement in LA County since she took office, and she's pressed charges in only one case, right? So that means 575 unprosecuted cases, right? And so we can look to those individual officers and sheriff's deputies and say they should be held accountable. We absolutely want that, but we also need to unpack a system that was created deliberately and intentionally to produce these outcomes. And so I always cite, there's a book by Manning Marable called How Capitalism Underdeveloped Black America, right? And in that book he talks about these different systems, and if you don't know who he is, he's one of the most brilliant black studies scholars that ever lived. And this text is a classic, and he really talks about the outcomes of these systems, and this not being something that we just stumble upon, but something that was deliberately created. So when I say they're all bad, I'm not talking about your individual folks that I see you shaking hands with them, right? I'm not talking about them as people. I'm talking about them as purveyors of oppression, right? And so it's really important that we understand people had great stories about Ronald Reagan, right? That he was this great man, right? And he was so kind and funny. Yeah, you know what he did to my people, right? He can be kind and funny and nice, but you know what he did to my people, right? So it's important that we look beyond personalities and think about how people function as ones who move forward systemic oppression. Does that make sense to y'all?
Yes.
And so I want to say that that's where Black Lives Matter is coming from. We are an abolitionist group. We believe in the end to prisons and police. We believe in reimagining public safety, so that doesn't mean that we walk the streets and there is no system of public safety. But you know what? Public safety does not mean spending over half of, in Los Angeles, we spend 53% of our city's general fund on police. We don't believe that's how you create safe communities. We don't believe safe communities are created when you hire more police to deal with homelessness, when the answer to homelessness is house keys, right? We don't believe that, Jackie Lacey often touts her mental health plan. We did a deep dive into her budget. She spends more on office supplies than she does her mental health program. So it's really important that when we talk about abolitionism and ending the system of policing, which includes LA County sheriffs, that it also is foundational when we think about abolitionism, and most of you are familiar with the term abolition as it relates to chattel slavery. The movement to end chattel slavery was not just about ending chattel slavery. It was about building up another system, building a system of black freedom. And so when we say abolish this policing as we know it, we're talking about building up an alternative system of public safety. And so that's kind of where we're coming from. We're grounded with these families. So the names that you called are families that we work with on a daily basis. So Quentin Thomas's partner, A.J. Weber's family, John Horton's mother, who's been struggling for justice for her son for more than 10 years. John Horton was beaten to death inside Men's Central Jail. They busted his liver, his spleen, his kidney. He had fractures in his skull, and then they claimed that he committed suicide. I don't know how you hang yourself and wind up with those injuries. That's impossible, right? And so we work with these families because we understand another truism, which is that we have a linked fate. What happens to one of us reverberates for all of us. And so it's really important that when Jamal Simpson is killed by sheriff's deputies in South Los Angeles, that we don't just see this as someone else's 21-year-old son. That I see it as a black mother of 3 children who also carry targets on their backs. And so I have to engage in the struggle for justice for Jamal Simpson, for Ryan Twyman, for A.J. Weber. It's important that all of us understand it as our sacred duty. That's what I call it, our sacred duty. This is not our job. I don't work for Black Lives Matter, right? Black Lives Matter has no budget other than when you decide you're not getting coffee and you give us your $5 instead, right? So this is not our job, but this is our sacred duty. I want to talk just a little bit. I see her moving up, so I hope I'm not talking too long. I want to
8
talk.
minutes and 43 seconds.
8 minutes, you said? So I have 7 left?
Yeah,
Okay.
well, according to him, he probably has some more.
I want to talk a little bit about what we see happening specifically at the hands of the sheriff. There's a pattern for LA County sheriffs that they are killing us with impunity. They are stealing the bodies of our loved ones with impunity. I mean, no one is being held accountable. Not by Villanueva, not by Jackie Lacey, not by anyone. They are not being held accountable. They are not being fired, and they are not being prosecuted. Okay, so they steal the body. That's the first thing that they engage in. But I think one of the things we also have to lift up is that after they kill the bodies of our loved ones, they engage in what Tandisizwe Chimaranga calls a double murder, the assassination of the character. And so if we lift up the stories of people like Ryan Twyman, we know Ryan Twyman was a 24-year-old young black man. In fact, he just turned 24. He was an active father of 3, countering all of the false narratives about black manhood that they throw at us constantly, right? Loving, active father of 3 little boys. And he wasn't doing anything. He was sitting in a parking lot with his partner, the mother of his children. And LA County sheriffs walked up, this is on video so you don't have to believe me, walked up on his car, opened the back door, and he's backing out, he's already backing out of the parking stall. What do? They shoot him. And then they go back after they murder him, go back to their car, get an AR-15, it was an AR-15, right? Assault rifle. Come back and kill him some more with the rifle. And then they tell a story about who is Ryan Twyman. They don't tell a story that Ryan Twyman was an active father of 3 children, that called his mama every day, that was his sister's best friend, that their family never had any issues in their families. It's a close-knit family that loves each other deeply, right? They don't tell that story. What they do is try and label Ryan a gang member, right? Do the same thing with A.J. Weber. They don't talk about him as a 16-year-old sweet-faced little boy, right? I'm the mother of a 15-year-old child. A 16-year-old child is a baby. That's a baby. What do? They say that he's a gang member that plagued the community, right? And then, so that's step 2. First, they kill the body, they assassinate the character, but what we're seeing more and more is the criminalization of the families and community who demand justice. So what we're seeing happen is the partner of Ryan Twyman, Daviel, witnessed the father of her children be murdered. Then herself becomes criminalized and held in a car looking at the dead body of the father of her children. Then is arrested for resisting arrest and is taken taken in for more than a day and we have to figure out how to get her out. The entire community becomes criminalized. If we think about A.J. Weber's case, sheriffs, deputies, then tell some fantastical story about A.J. Weber who walked out. I was there within 30 minutes of his murder. They say A.J. Weber walked out of this Super Bowl party. We live in LA, so it's not always cold in February. It was a super hot February night, and walked out with no shirt on. Sheriff's deputies tell a story about how there was a gun in his waistband. A gun that mysteriously vanished from a completely secured crime scene. Where is the gun? So what they did is go in and claim that the entire community is criminal, and they conspired somehow to steal the gun that they never ever recovered. So we see three things happening: the theft of the body, the assassination of the character, and then the criminalization of the families and the community. So I'm going to just close with this because I heard a little beep beep. I want to close with this, that there's a lot that we do as organizers, and I see Michelle and Andres and others in the room. We understand that it's important that we not just have bodies like the Civilian Oversight Commission, but that we have engaged folks who show up at these meetings and demand justice. And so we show up at these meetings every month and demand justice alongside the family members, right? And we yell things like, check, check, check the sheriff, right? And so we make sure that we do that. But we also recognize that there's many tools. And so one of the victories that we had was the passage of SB 1421, which is the California Right to Know bill, which went into effect in January of this year. What's supposed to happen with this bill is we're supposed to gain access to public records. California was one of the most secretive states in the entire nation, if not the most secretive state in the entire nation, in protecting the records of law enforcement who are corrupt and sometimes murderous. When we passed 1421, what we thought we were going to use it for, and what we've been using it for with other policing units, is to get the records of these police officers and get records around the murders of our folks. LA County Sheriffs has flat out refused to give us any of the records that we filed. They've given us zero. On October 29th of this year, we filed a lawsuit through ACLU, filed a lawsuit demanding the release of these records. Villanueva, who ran as a so-called progressive, has been the absolute worst in the entire state of California in terms of transparency. And so we need to make sure that we use all of our tools to, one, expose him, but also to remember that we have power. The people have power to get him out, to hold the sheriff's department accountable, and to make sure that we summon our collective voice to usher in a reimagined system of public safety.
All of the information that they've shared with you is essential, but what's even more important is that we have a community that is committed, that is engaged, and that's informed. And there were 11 organizations that co-sponsored this event. If you don't know how to plug in, look at the bottom of this sheet. It talks about the organizations. I can tell you, because I'm one of those organizations, most of these organizations really need your help, including the ACLU. So we're excited that you're here and that you're interested enough to be informed, but we also need your involvement. So please consider it.
Right now what we're dealing with is the elected sheriff that is currently in office. There will be several sheriffs after him and several boards that follow this board, and this will certainly set the precedent for how those interactions continue. Right now what we're dealing with is issues where we're trying to better understand through the county ordinance who has jurisdiction over what. So initially, like we stated, the sheriff brought back Deputy Mondoyan. That created a lot of issues throughout the community and certainly with the board. And what we found with taking that and litigating that issue is that the sheriff has very specific things that he is tasked with. He oversees the jails and he oversees criminal investigations. He does not have the ability to settle litigation on behalf of the county, nor does he have the official responsibility to hire deputies without complying with the county law, and that includes civil service rulings. So what we found with Deputy Mondoyan is that the civil service ruled that he would be removed from the department, and when the new sheriff came into town, he decided that he wanted to reinstate that sheriff deputy. And so again, we're constantly battling what the jurisdiction of the board is versus what the jurisdiction of the sheriff is. As we run into issues where we're trying to, again, create more transparency and giving the Office of the Inspector General the ability to issue subpoenas to get down to the bottom of some of these issues that are arising within the department, the sheriff now argues that he doesn't believe the county council has the potential to really represent him because he perceives a conflict, because he says that they do not agree with his opinion. But what we find with this issue is that the sheriff does not have jurisdiction to decide on this matter. This solely rests with the board. So right now we're certainly going back and forth in litigating matters. He has his separate outside counsel that is dealing with county council. And again, these decisions will set the precedent for how future sheriffs deal with future boards and who has the jurisdiction to make what decisions in those interactions. So again, Supervisor Barger certainly understands that as an elected official, she has the responsibility to work with other elected officials because that's what the community expects. She expects them to kind of put their best foot forward and try to come to an understanding on these issues and try to find a basis for things that they can agree upon and build from there for the sake of public safety. So in terms of the dealings with the board and the sheriff and the legal grounds for all of that, that's where we're at this stage in the game. Certainly things continue to be litigated, but I think that they've drawn a very clear line in the sand through the county ordinance as to what authorities lie with the sheriff and those that lie with the Board of Supervisors. Thank you.
The first question, and I think I want to direct this question to Brian. The sheriff is elected. The Board of Supervisors controls the budget. Is it time to change to a hired sheriff?
I will tell you this, that's a very issue we're going to discuss at our community policing conference this Saturday at St. Anne's Center from 9 until 3 p.m. You go on our website, www.LA-County-Sheriff's-Oversight-Commission.com to find out about it. So we're going to discuss that issue. I think there's certainly some gravity toward that because the only way, again, to get rid of a sheriff is to not re-elect him or to have him or her arrested.
Recall.
Or recall, which is very difficult to do.
Right, and we do know that it's really hard for an incumbent to not win an election. Obviously, that's the first time that's happened in over 100 years. The role of the citizens who have the ability to make a noise, that's where the real change comes from. The real change comes from the people. Okay, someone has asked, and I think I want to give this one to you, Linda. Are the shootings deliberate, or are they possibly due to stress that accumulates over time? If an officer is afraid for his or her life when it is unwarranted, perhaps that officer needs to be rotated to a desk job or let go. Please comment.
A stat that I really like is that we always hear how difficult it is to be a cop.
I'll be what?
Thank you. Thank you.
All these years,
Right, all my life, right.
we fear our life.
I think it's important in terms of jobs that we understand that being a police officer, including a sheriff, is not even one of the 15 most dangerous jobs. It's more dangerous to be a logger or a meat packer or a cab driver or a traveling salesman than to be a police officer. So this whole question about, well, maybe if we just attended more to the mental health of officers, maybe we reduce these killings. The problem is what they're built to do in the first place. And so I don't think it's about, making sure they have enough time off or that they have mindfulness training, right? I don't think that's going to settle it. I think it's really being courageous enough and visionary enough to, again, reimagine systems of public safety. And just as I end, I neglected to point to Billion, who's in the back, who leads Africatown Coalition, who's been doing a lot of work around ending the violence upon our communities too. So thank you, Billion.
Thank you.
The next question is for Sam. Sam, thank you. One of those things that you noted was the presence of some sort of gang affiliation within the department. So someone has a question and said, tell us more about deputy gangs.
When I first started practicing law was in 1972. At that time, one of the federal court judges in downtown Los Angeles issued an injunction against the gang out of Linwood, or Century City Department, substation I should say. It was called the Vikings, and found that they were essentially neo-Nazis wearing uniforms, and wrote an injunction against them acting the way they were acting in terms of a long history of beating up people. It's continued, and it's continued in many different forms and in different names and different substations. But it's something that has been tolerated by the sheriffs continuously all these years. Tattooed gangs, gangs that actually have emblems of Nazism on their body, tolerated. It's just a culture that has been ingrained in the department, and it's still there. I don't think I got to my article that there's the FBI is now investigating them, the department, and officers who are to try to find out whether there's a criminal element that is involved. And part of what the articles that have been written this year show that there's been a civil lawsuit filed by 8 deputies against the department who were beat up by the banditos in East LA, and then and the banditos were also soliciting money. They called it taxes, and that some of that money, their allegation in the complaint is that some of the money was actually going for the banditos' vacations, and this has been apparently tolerated by the department, by the sergeants and the people, and many of the sergeants are involved. So it's a culture that's been there for many years, and it's one that I know the Office of Independent Investigation is trying to go look into it, and that was part of the issues about the subpoenas and why it became necessary to get the subpoenas, subpoena power for the OIG in order for him and his office to do the job of investigating these criminal activities in the department.
Thank you.
This next question is for Brian. Can the Board of Supervisors change the commissioner's powers, for example, give them subpoena power?
Yeah, that issue is being researched by the board, by county council right now to allow us to have subpoena power. There's also, of course, the ballot measure that's going to come up early next year in terms of giving the commission subpoena power as well. I think that's important personally for that ballot measure to pass, because boards can change, and the board at some point, if it has a different composition in 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years, can decide to take that subpoena power away from us. So that's my off-work hour plug for the subpoena power issue, but I think it's important for the commission.
Absolutely. You said over and over that you were powerless, that you can't hire, you can't fire. So it seems to me that subpoena power could change that. So thank you. Melina, someone is asking, you've used the term reimagining a system of public safety. How far along has your organization, the people that you interface with, how far along have they been able to come up with a vision of a different type of public safety?
So this is happening all over the world, this reimagining of public safety. And different locales are further along than others. I think of examples like Newark, New Jersey, where Mayor Baca, working with someone who's actually from LA, Akila Sherrills, has been building community teams to address crime in communities. So they're actually hiring mostly formerly incarcerated folks to deal with crimes in their own neighborhoods. And what we've seen is every year dramatic drops in the levels of violent crime. So the premise is that communities are best equipped to deal with their own, questions and to deal with their own questions of safety. And we've seen it work in places like Newark, New Jersey. We're seeing it happen under Chokwe Lumumba in Jackson, Mississippi. We're seeing even, let me be real clear, I don't endorse anybody who's running for district attorney. I just want Jackie Lacey out. However, I want to uplift one thing that we see in San Francisco County is a vision for decarceration. And so in San Francisco County, we see virtually no youth incarcerated. I think there's fewer than 20 young people who are incarcerated in San Francisco County. And so they're looking at restorative justice models. And then we can look at what's happening outside of government, right? The work of organizations like Youth Justice Coalition, Community Coalition, and others, over the last several years, we've seen in terms of youth incarceration, a drop of 54% in terms of youth incarceration. And when you think about people like Brian Stevenson really saying that our kids do not belong in prisons, right? And so I think this reimagining is taking place everywhere from governments to communities to individuals. And when we have the will, we see it really begin to move.
Thank you. Sam, you were involved with the CCJV, the Citizens Commission on Jail Violence, back in 2012. And we have a question here that asks about the Los Angeles County Supervisors being given greater oversight. And so the question is, should we look toward giving the LA County Board of Supervisors more control? Was there a reason that the path that was taken was to develop this civilian commission? Was there any consideration into trying to change the role of the Board of Supervisors?
No, I don't think so. I think that the supervisors felt that the creation of the reforms with then the blessing of the Sheriff's Department by McDonald, I think that they felt that was sufficient because they felt that the department itself had to be involved with the reforms and really put them in action. And the creation of the Office of Independent Investigation was also a good thing. There was one thing that I thought that I'd like to see reincorporated, and that is that there used to be a special counsel for the Los Angeles Sheriff's Department who would write, I think they were quarterly reports on the department, and that was replaced by the IG's office. I think that, I thought that those reports were extremely helpful, especially in terms of uncovering and making public many of the findings over a period of time, where the special counsel would make suggestions and find deficiencies in how the sheriff was operating. Everything from shootings to jails to misconduct was rigorously looked at, and I don't know whether the OIG now has the time or the same resources to do those same kind of reports. But they were very helpful to those of us who were litigating in federal court many of the police shootings and the deaths in the jails, suicides in the jails, because those were things that had been touched on, where we could show that the department had notice of the deficiencies and didn't do anything to correct them.
We have several questions here from a woman who says that she is the mother of a son and she's scared for her son's life. And I need to tell her, and to any other mothers here, that I'm in the same boat with you. I'm the mother of a black young man, and I'm scared for my son's life every single day.
I need to speak on that because last night, it's been going on ever since he was 17. He traveled the world, he's a nurse, he's a father now, and they are now GPSing him, getting him out of his car. And I think because he changed his name from Sterling to Chicago, I'm not sure. But he was born and raised here in Altadena, and I have witnesses here that they are now I had to come here today. I was sent, you need to read Melina James Farson,
Okay.
something to Melina.
So the purpose of this event tonight, and the purpose of why we all do what we do, is we have to change the system. I don't think that anyone should walk out of here expecting for that change to happen because you came to this event. But you came here to share your information, to connect with people who are trying to make change.
Hope I'm not another Sandra Bland.
Yes, I hope not too. But we're not going to solve all this in one night. But what we are doing is providing you with an opportunity to connect with people and individuals who can help. So we're going to ask you to connect with these people, and we will share that information outside of these doors, or at the table back there. Chris is pointing at the table. There's a resource table that gives you an opportunity to connect with people. And believe me, they need your help. I'm going to go with one last question. And that question has to do with surveillance of activists. So law enforcement, obviously we talked about drones, but there are other technologies that are currently being used. The ACLU has a list of at least 8 different technologies that are being used by law enforcement agencies, not just here in Southern California, but actually across the United States. We need to find ways to resist and to organize around protecting ourselves against the surveillance equipment. And I was wondering if I don't know which of the 3 of you would like to talk to the surveillance of the community by law enforcement, but whoever would like to jump in and talk about opportunities to resist that.
Right.
I think it was the ACLU out here who did perhaps if someone here did a PRA on the number of times their license plate had been captured by the Pasadena Police Department. Where does that information go, right? If the law enforcement decides to add facial recognition technology to body-worn cameras, or maybe cameras on their car, where does that information go? How many times is that information or that recognition wrong? And studies, of course, are now saying that people with a darker hue are misidentified at a higher rate than any other group of people. Yeah, exactly. So it's something that the commission in our long-range plan is going to look at. But personally, I think it's an incredibly important issue for me because there's so much data that's being captured. The question is, who has that data? What's being done with it? What are our rights to not have that information captured?
And I would just recommend anyone that really is interested in this, that the ACLU website, both the national ACLU and the Southern California website, has information on that. There's been many reports that have been put out by a number of organizations, and they've collected that information. So I think it's a good place if you're interested. The ACLU does a tremendous amount of great work. I've been on the national board for 30 years, and on the Southern California board for 40 years, and I've been, as they've grown, I have had the blessing of being able to understand how great and how much they do.
I'll just add that folks should look at the work that's been done by Stop LAPD Spying Coalition.
Yes.
They have an entire mapping of what they call the architecture of surveillance. And it's really important that we understand that we are being watched and surveilled, and especially if you're an organizer or an activist. So there's all these tools that they use, but then there's also things that are just easily and publicly accessible, like the way in which you tell on yourself on social media, right? And I know from my own cases that they follow activists on social media, they collect our information, they figure out who knows who based on who's friends with who, and they use this in cases against us, including conspiracy cases. And so it's really important that we understand how that information is being used. And then I think the final thing that's important as we talk about surveillance, part of surveillance is absolutely knowing what we're doing and trying to build long-term cases on us. Part of it, though, is to intimidate us out of organizing, right? Well, they might know that I'm planning to go to a march. I don't want them to recognize my face or my car. I don't want you're already being profiled, you're already being watched, right? So don't let the fact that they're watching you stop you from doing the work that's necessary for us to get free.
Thank you, Melina. What Melina said just reminded me, I saw a quick video about what was happening in New York City. Young people of color, mostly males, were being stopped by the transit police for not paying. And one day, everybody decided to jump the turnstiles. Everybody, old, young, black, white, everybody. When the masses get involved, we have change. So, the League of Women Voters, thank you so much for having us here, for giving us an opportunity to connect with each other, but also thank you, the ACLU of Southern California, the Altadena Town Councilwoman Veronica Jones, the Interdenominational Ministerial Alliance of Greater Pasadena, Indivisible Pasadena, the NAACP Pasadena, Neighbors Building a Better Altadena, and the LA Progressive. Every single organization that I named needs your help. So please vote, but more than vote, stay engaged and committed to change. Thank you for being here.